The war in Europe was supposed to end in a storm of fire. German generals boasted of last-ditch defenses, propaganda promised miracle weapons, and Hitler himself swore that his armies would never bow to the advancing Allies. Yet in the spring of 1945, in one of the most extraordinary and overlooked twists of World War II, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers made a choice that stunned even their enemies. They did not unleash a desperate final stand. They did not carve their names into the ruins of cities or the trenches of the Reich. Instead, nearly 500,000 men laid down their arms and walked willingly into American captivity. It was not simply defeat. It was surrender on a scale so vast that it rewrote the meaning of victory. And the story of why they did it, why hardened troops trained in loyalty to the Führer abandoned the battlefield without a fight, is as human as it is historic. This moment did not unfold in a single place or time. It was not the result of one battle but of countless decisions by soldiers who could see that the Reich they fought for was crumbling from within. By the time American forces pushed into Germany from the west, entire divisions faced a reality that no amount of propaganda could conceal. The Luftwaffe was grounded, its fuel gone. The Wehrmacht was fractured, scattered across shrinking pockets of defense. Tanks lay abandoned for lack of spare parts. And ordinary soldiers, many of them barely out of their teens, began asking a dangerous question. Why die for a regime that no longer had a future? The staggering wave of surrender revealed something even more telling. The men who capitulated were not cowards. They were not driven solely by fear of Allied firepower. Many had fought for years in brutal campaigns across Europe and the Eastern Front. What they realized in 1945 was that survival itself had become an act of rebellion against the promises of Nazi leadership. They had been told that to surrender was shameful, that to stop fighting was to betray their nation. But when faced with starvation, bombardment, and the certainty that their families would inherit nothing but ruins, surrender began to look less like betrayal and more like salvation. To understand the scale of this phenomenon, picture the Rhine River as American troops approached its banks. The river had long been described by German propaganda as an impenetrable barrier, the last shield of the Reich. Hitler himself declared that the Allies would never cross it. Yet in March 1945, when U.S. forces reached the town of Remagen and discovered the Ludendorff Bridge still standing, they surged across in a matter of hours. What was supposed to be a decisive defensive line collapsed instantly. Within days, entire German units in the West were surrounded. Their commanders faced a choice: fight hopelessly and see their men annihilated, or accept that the war was lost and seek terms with the advancing Americans. The decision to surrender was not merely strategic. It was also deeply psychological. Soldiers on the ground had grown accustomed to the difference between American and Soviet treatment of prisoners. Tales spread quickly among the ranks. Captivity under the Red Army meant a near-certain march to Siberia, where disease, hunger, and brutal conditions awaited. But those who laid down arms before the Americans often found themselves housed in organized camps with food, medical care, and at least the faint prospect of dignity. For men who had been fighting for years without adequate rations or rest, the prospect of a hot meal behind American lines was sometimes more compelling than the dream of a German victory. The irony is striking. The very soldiers indoctrinated to see Americans as weak, materialistic, and incapable of enduring hardship suddenly began to view surrendering to them as the only way to preserve their lives. Officers who once preached the creed of victory or death discovered that their troops were more interested in avoiding pointless slaughter than defending Hitler's fantasy of a 1,000-year Reich. The collapse of morale was not abstract. It could be measured in the sheer speed with which divisions disintegrated once the Americans pushed forward. As the Allies advanced into the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany, they trapped more than 300,000 German troops. It became one of the largest encirclements of the entire war. Yet, unlike earlier pockets, such as Stalingrad where the German Sixth Army fought bitterly until starvation forced surrender, in the Ruhr the soldiers capitulated en masse with little resistance. Trucks carried them by the thousands into sprawling temporary camps. Barbed wire and open fields became holding pens for men who only weeks earlier had worn the proud eagle and swastika on their uniforms. Within a short span, the numbers swelled to nearly 500,000. A logistical challenge that left American commanders astonished. Eisenhower himself called the scale of surrender unprecedented. The decision of these soldiers reshaped not only the final weeks of the war but also the legacy of the conflict. Their surrender deprived Hitler of the manpower he so desperately needed for his fantasy of prolonging the struggle. It ensured that the war in Western Europe ended sooner than even Allied planners had dared hope. And it showed that at the core of every army, no matter how fiercely indoctrinated, lies a truth that cannot be erased by ideology: the will to survive. Yet this mass surrender was not purely an act of resignation. For some German soldiers, it carried a strange sense of relief. After years of fighting in Russia, Italy, France, and across their own homeland, the war had become a cycle of exhaustion with no horizon of hope. Surrender meant more than avoiding death. It meant ending a nightmare. Letters smuggled from prisoners to their families spoke not of shame, but of gratitude that they were alive. For wives and mothers who had already buried sons, for children who had grown up under the shadow of bombings, the news that a loved one was in American hands could feel like a miracle. Still, not everyone viewed surrender as honorable. Within the shrinking circles of Nazi leadership, those who laid down their arms were denounced as traitors. Goebbels railed in speeches about cowardly capitulators, warning that history would condemn them. SS units, bound by fanatic loyalty, sometimes executed their own comrades who attempted to desert or surrender. But these punishments could not reverse the tide. The sheer momentum of collapse was greater than any propaganda. By April 1945, it was clear to the average soldier that Hitler's promises were lies, and that the Reich's survival was measured not in years, but in days. What makes this episode even more remarkable is how quietly it was forgotten in the aftermath of the war. In Allied histories, the focus fell on the dramatic battles, the crossing of the Rhine, the liberation of camps, the final push into Berlin. In German memory, surrender carried a stain, a reminder of humiliation. But beneath those layers of narrative lies an untold story, that of men who recognized futility and chose life instead of death. Their decision transformed the closing act of World War II into something unexpected, not a last bloody stand, but a cascade of white flags. And this raises the most haunting question of all. Did these men see themselves as victims of a failed cause, or as agents of their own destiny in choosing to survive? The answer may never be fully known, for in surrendering they gave up not only their weapons but also their voices in the story of victory. Yet their silent march into captivity spoke louder than any speech. It told the world that even in the heart of war, humanity's most powerful instinct is not to destroy, but to endure. This is where the journey begins. In the paradox of a defeated army that dissolved not with a bang but with a surrender so vast that it reshaped the war's finale. To uncover why 500,000 men made this choice, we must look beyond the battlefield into the minds of soldiers, the fears of families, and the crumbling illusions of a regime that demanded sacrifice until the very end. Their story is not one of glory, but of revelation. A revelation that survival itself can sometimes be the most radical act of defiance. As the spring sun rose over the shattered landscapes of Western Germany, the soldiers who had surrendered began to experience a new reality, one that none of them had anticipated when they made the decision to walk toward American lines. The act of surrender, while seemingly simple, opened a complex web of bureaucracy, logistics, and human interaction that would define the closing months of the European war. For 500,000 men, life as a prisoner of war was far from mere captivity. It became a study in adaptation, resilience, and an unexpected confrontation with humanity itself. American forces, initially stunned by the sheer number of Germans laying down arms, scrambled to establish temporary camps. Fields near small towns, once quiet under the weight of war, became bustling hubs of organized surrender. Soldiers who had only days earlier been prepared to fight to the last man were now tasked with obeying new rules. Instructions flowed down through the chain of command. Men were to be disarmed, counted, provided with food and water, and moved to holding areas until permanent camps could be arranged. For many, the first encounters with their captors were surreal. They had expected the worst: rage, execution, humiliation, but instead were met with efficiency, a calm authority, and surprisingly humane treatment. The contrast was stark. Years of Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as decadent, weak, and incapable of endurance. Soldiers had been trained to despise them, to imagine their hands filled with indulgence while their own comrades starved on frozen fronts. Yet as German soldiers stood in orderly lines, receiving rations, blankets, and directions in a language that was foreign yet practical, doubts began to seep in. Could this be true? Could the enemy really be offering sustenance rather than punishment? It was a cognitive dissonance that many carried silently, unsure how to reconcile years of indoctrination with the immediate evidence of their senses. For the soldiers themselves, surrender was a mixture of relief and fear. They had crossed invisible lines, walking into the unknown. Some feared that American kindness was a prelude to deception, a trap designed to extract intelligence before disposal. Others felt a quiet shame, aware that laying down arms went against every lesson drilled into them since enlistment. Yet the urgency of survival outweighed ideology. They had witnessed devastation, loss, and hopelessness, and the promise of food, safety, and an end to immediate danger became more compelling than abstract notions of honor or duty. Logistically, managing 500,000 surrendering soldiers was a monumental challenge. Camps were set up on open fields, in warehouses, and even on railway sidings. Thousands of soldiers were assigned to temporary accommodations, often with minimal equipment. The Americans relied heavily on rapid organization, improvising kitchens, medical stations, and guard rotations. Officers instructed their men to treat the prisoners firmly but fairly, knowing that the efficiency of the operation depended on cooperation. Remarkably, the German soldiers complied. The very discipline that had made them formidable on the battlefield now allowed the surrender to proceed with relative order. Inside the camps, the experience of captivity varied widely. For some, life under American control was almost comfortable compared to the brutal winters on the Eastern Front. Medical care was available, injuries treated promptly, and food, while simple, was plentiful compared to months of starvation. Letters home could be sent under supervision, and small groups were sometimes allowed supervised work assignments, helping with the maintenance of the camp or local infrastructure. For men accustomed to constant fear and deprivation, these small allowances of dignity and routine were transformative. Yet the experience was not without its tensions. Language barriers, lingering mistrust, and cultural differences created friction. Some American guards, hardened by years of combat, initially struggled to suppress disdain for their captives. Meanwhile, German soldiers wrestled with humiliation and anxiety. Many worried that their families would see them as cowards or that their names would be lost to history as men who surrendered rather than fought. For older, battle-hardened troops, the act of walking into captivity was both a moral and psychological trial. They were forced to redefine courage, understanding that survival could coexist with honor if framed as a rational choice. Over time, prisoners began to adapt to camp life. They formed communities within the boundaries of confinement, recreating social structures reminiscent of their former units. Officers held discussions on daily routines, soldiers organized sports and card games, and small cultural events emerged. Music was shared, stories told, and the bonds formed in adversity took on a new dimension. For men who had spent years under extreme conditions, these microcosms of order and camaraderie became essential for maintaining sanity. Adaptation, more than submission, became the guiding principle of survival. Meanwhile, the American forces faced the dual task of security and humanitarian care. While mass surrenders simplified military operations in some ways, large-scale combat was avoided. It also created logistical pressure. Food, clothing, and shelter had to be supplied in unprecedented quantities. Transportation had to be organized to move prisoners to permanent facilities. Intelligence officers combed through the surrendered ranks, seeking information about troop movements, supply caches, and lingering German units still resisting elsewhere. The scale of the surrender turned routine operations into extraordinary coordination efforts, revealing the administrative sophistication that had allowed the Allies to sustain their campaigns across Europe. Psychologically, surrender reshaped perceptions on both sides. American soldiers, expecting hostility, were struck by compliance and even gratitude from their captives. Many Germans, facing a future in captivity, discovered an unexpected capacity for resilience and self-discipline. Letters written from camps reveal introspection among the prisoners, accounts of past mistakes, reflections on lost comrades, and newfound appreciation for life in the absence of combat. In many ways, the act of surrender forced both groups to confront the humanity of the other, breaking down the ideological walls built by years of war. The decision to surrender also had a cascading effect on German military units still engaged in the field. Seeing entire regiments lay down arms encouraged other units to follow suit. Rumors traveled rapidly. The Americans treated prisoners humanely. The alternative, continued resistance, was futile and often fatal. This ripple effect accelerated the collapse of German defenses, allowing the Allies to advance more rapidly than anticipated. Soldiers' choices were influenced not just by immediate survival but by the realization that collective surrender offered a safer path for themselves and their comrades. The camps themselves became experiments in integration and psychological rehabilitation. Soldiers were encouraged to engage in structured activities, maintain hygiene, and participate in educational programs. Red Cross parcels provided not only sustenance but also a connection to the outside world. For men who had been conditioned to a rigid, militarized worldview, these interventions were sometimes the first exposure to compassion and order that was not enforced through fear. Gradually, prisoners began to see themselves not merely as vanquished enemies but as human beings capable of learning, reflecting, and surviving beyond the battlefield. Even as the war drew to its inevitable conclusion, surrender continued to shape outcomes. Commanders in remaining German pockets recognized that prolonging resistance would only bring destruction. The logic of self-preservation and the experience of witnessing mass surrender made resistance appear increasingly senseless. By May 1945, the surrender of these soldiers had become both a practical and symbolic turning point, the collapse of one of the largest, most disciplined military forces in history without a last, cataclysmic fight in the West. This extraordinary wave of surrender demonstrates that the conclusion of a war is rarely determined solely by strategy or firepower. Human psychology, perceptions of survival, and the interaction of fear and reason all played a decisive role. Soldiers acted not merely as components of a military machine but as individuals navigating impossible choices under extreme conditions. Their decision to surrender on such a massive scale stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of collective rationality, proving that even in total war, the will to live can eclipse the indoctrination of years and the pressures of hierarchy. And in these decisions lies a lesson far broader than any single campaign or battlefield. The surrender of 500,000 soldiers underscores the power of choice, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unexpected ways that empathy and pragmatism can shape history. Behind the lines, behind the fences, and even amid the bureaucratic chaos of camp life, ordinary men made extraordinary decisions. By choosing life over ideology, surrender over suicidal obedience, they altered not only their own fates but the course of the European war. Beyond the immediate relief of surrender, the American-controlled POW camps became arenas of adaptation and transformation. For the German soldiers, the shift from combat to confinement was not simply physical, it was psychological, cultural, and moral. Men trained to obey without question now faced an entirely different authority, one that operated not through fear or ideology but through structure, fairness, and logistical precision. The adjustment was disorienting. Some soldiers welcomed it eagerly, others struggled to reconcile a lifetime of militarized conditioning with the unexpected reality that obedience no longer carried the threat of death. Inside the camps, daily routines were established swiftly. Early mornings brought head counts, organized queues for meals, and assignments for maintenance tasks. Soldiers who had marched thousands of miles through mud, snow, and blood now learned to navigate communal kitchens, sanitation systems, and medical checks. Camp officers, both German and American, worked to maintain order. They quickly realized that the discipline ingrained in these men was a tool to facilitate the management of vast numbers. Ironically, the very obedience that had once enabled battlefield operations now smoothed the surrender process, allowing hundreds of thousands of men to adapt to a completely new reality without chaos. Medical care became a cornerstone of life in captivity. Years of combat had left countless soldiers malnourished, frostbitten, and wounded, American doctors and nurses, sometimes assisted by German medics who had surrendered, established triage centers, providing treatment that often surpassed what soldiers had experienced during the final months of the Reich. Simple procedures, which would have been impossible in the field, were now routine. Wounds were cleaned, infections treated, and nutritional needs addressed. Soldiers who had once feared death from minor injuries began to understand that surrender had afforded them the chance to survive conditions that would otherwise have been fatal. Language and communication became crucial. Camp life demanded interaction between captors and captives, a challenge given the barrier of tongues. Yet even without fluency, gestures, basic words, and a shared understanding of routine allowed cooperation to flourish. Work assignments, cooking shifts, and educational activities became opportunities to bridge the divide. Soldiers gradually realized that the Americans were not enemies in the personal sense. They were administrators of a system designed to manage and protect, rather than destroy, the men who had surrendered. This subtle realization was transformative. Psychologically, surrender had layered consequences. For some, it was relief. For others, shame. Men had been raised to believe that surrender was dishonorable, a betrayal of their country and comrades. Yet seeing the practical benefits, safety, food, shelter, and relative freedom within the confines of the camp challenged long-held beliefs. Many wrote letters home expressing not pride in heroic deeds but gratitude for survival. These letters, censored yet revealing, provide insight into a profound internal recalibration. Soldiers were redefining courage as the ability to live and endure, rather than die for an increasingly meaningless cause. Education and self-improvement became unexpected features of camp life. Classes on basic literacy, technical skills, and even languages were offered. For young soldiers who had joined the Wehrmacht as teenagers, these programs were the first exposure to opportunities outside of military instruction. Reading, writing, and small-scale vocational training allowed them to envision a future that extended beyond battlefields and trenches. This was not merely a tool of rehabilitation but a method of psychological stabilization. Men who had spent years under constant threat began to see themselves as capable of planning, thinking, and contributing in ways that had been impossible during active service. The interaction between American guards and German soldiers developed into a complex relationship of mutual recognition. Initially, soldiers feared punitive measures, expecting hostility or cruelty. Yet the Americans, many of whom were themselves exhausted and weary after years of combat, treated prisoners with a combination of firmness and fairness. They understood that maintaining morale among captives was essential for order. Over time, mutual respect emerged, not camaraderie, but a recognition of shared humanity. Soldiers who had once fought to kill now found themselves capable of cooperation, conversation, and even moments of humor across language barriers. The scale of surrender influenced American military planning in real time. Camps had to be expanded, logistics adjusted, and supply lines diverted to accommodate the unexpected influx. Officers realized that managing prisoners on such a scale was as challenging as engaging an enemy in battle. Feeding, housing, and transporting 500,000 men required coordination that pushed the limits of available resources. The efficiency with which this challenge was met is a testament to the organization and foresight of the U.S. military, as well as the discipline of the surrendered soldiers themselves. In addition to daily routines, cultural and recreational activities emerged as coping mechanisms. Soldiers organized soccer matches, card games, and small performances, sometimes under the supervision of American officers. Music was shared, stories exchanged, and rituals reminiscent of pre-war life recreated. These activities were not trivial, they were crucial in maintaining mental health and morale. Men who had endured years of constant fear and violence began to experience a sense of normalcy, however limited, within the constraints of captivity. The surrender also accelerated the collapse of remaining German resistance. Units that had not yet laid down arms witnessed the orderly treatment of their comrades and recognized the futility of further engagement. Rumors of humane conditions spread quickly. The Americans were not executing prisoners, the food was adequate, and survival was possible. In many cases, this intelligence prompted additional surrenders, creating a feedback loop that hastened the end of combat operations in Western Europe. The psychological impact of seeing entire divisions capitulate cannot be overstated. It transformed fear of the enemy into a rational evaluation of survival. Letters and testimonies from former prisoners reveal a common theme. Surrender was not a single act of desperation, but a deliberate choice informed by experience, observation, and rational assessment. Soldiers weighed the alternatives. Continue fighting with diminishing supplies, face likely death, or surrender and secure the possibility of life beyond the war. For many, the calculus was straightforward. The decision to walk into American custody was simultaneously pragmatic, courageous, and profoundly human. Even within the camps, soldiers confronted lingering doubts about their choices. Some questioned whether survival at the cost of perceived honor was truly acceptable. Others reconciled that survival itself was the ultimate form of defiance against a regime that had demanded death for abstract ideology. In choosing life, they not only preserved themselves but also created the opportunity to reflect, learn, and ultimately reintegrate into a world that, despite devastation, was rebuilding. The surrender of 500,000 soldiers is remarkable not just for its scale but for what it reveals about human behavior under extreme conditions. It challenges simplistic narratives of heroism and cowardice, illustrating that rational choice, moral agency, and self-preservation are central even amid the chaos of war. By surrendering, these men exercise judgment in the face of overwhelming pressure, demonstrating that obedience to ideology has limits when confronted with the fundamental instinct to survive. And yet, surrender was not the end of the story. For these men, captivity was the beginning of a different struggle, adaptation, rehabilitation, and the reconstruction of identity after years defined entirely by warfare. They would emerge from camps into a Germany transformed, a world that demanded they redefine themselves outside the prism of combat. In many ways, their surrender was both the conclusion of one chapter and the start of another, a transition from instruments of war to citizens, survivors, and witnesses of history. The broader consequences of the surrender became apparent almost immediately. Commanders in the remaining German strongholds faced a reality that was impossible to ignore. Entire divisions had simply vanished from the battlefield, choosing captivity over combat. The collapse of these units did more than weaken the front lines. It shattered the ideological cohesion that had sustained the Wehrmacht for years. Soldiers who had once been convinced that surrender was betrayal were now confronted with an undeniable truth. Survival was possible and, in many cases, preferable. The surrender also forced the Allies to adapt their strategies in real time. The influx of hundreds of thousands of prisoners demanded significant logistical planning. Food, clothing, shelter, and medical care had to be scaled rapidly to meet unprecedented demand. Transportation networks were stretched to their limits as trucks, trains, and makeshift convoys ferried soldiers to permanent camps. American officers realized that the management of prisoners could no longer be treated as an afterthought. It was now a central component of the military operation in Germany. Remarkably, these challenges were met with efficiency, demonstrating the organizational capability of the Allied forces while highlighting the obedience and adaptability of the surrendered soldiers. Within the camps, routines were carefully established to maintain order and ensure the well-being of the prisoners. Early mornings began with roll calls and inspections, followed by organized meal times and work assignments. Soldiers were encouraged to engage in productive tasks such as camp maintenance, cleaning, and construction of basic facilities. Medical teams conducted regular checkups, treating injuries, illnesses, and malnutrition. For many prisoners, these routines provided a sense of structure and purpose that had been absent in the chaotic final months of the war. The predictability of camp life offered a psychological reprieve, allowing men to regain a measure of stability after years of uncertainty. The interaction between American guards and German prisoners evolved into a complex relationship characterized by mutual observation and cautious respect. Initially, suspicion permeated the camp. Soldiers expected hostility, while guards anticipated resistance or deception. Yet as time passed, both sides adapted. Prisoners realized that compliance was rewarded with relative comfort and safety, while guards recognized that humane treatment facilitated order and reduced the likelihood of conflict. Small gestures, A shared meal, a conversation across a fence, assistance with a medical need, gradually built an unspoken understanding that the war, while still ongoing on the broader scale, had created pockets where human decency could prevail. The psychological impact of surrender extended beyond the individual soldiers. Families back in Germany and occupied territories learned that their loved ones were alive, albeit in captivity. Letters smuggled through Red Cross channels carried news of survival, medical care, and basic comforts. These communications, carefully monitored, often contained expressions of relief and gratitude rather than shame or defeat. For many civilians who had endured bombings, shortages, and the constant fear of conscription, knowing that relatives were safe behind American lines offered a rare sense of hope amid devastation. Interestingly, the surrender catalyzed a reevaluation of personal identity among the German soldiers. Years of immersion in military culture had defined their lives, instilling obedience, discipline, and adherence to hierarchical authority. Yet in the camps, soldiers were confronted with a different form of authority, one based on rules, organization, and the protection of life rather than ideology. This exposure challenged deeply ingrained notions of duty and honor. Men who had fought tirelessly under strict commands began to reconsider the meaning of service, loyalty, and personal agency. Surrender, initially perceived as shameful, became reframed as a rational, strategic choice that preserved life and enabled reflection. The camps also provided opportunities for education and self-improvement. Classes in literacy, vocational skills, and basic arithmetic were offered to prisoners who had previously received limited formal instruction. Young soldiers, many of whom had joined the military as teenagers, discovered that they could learn, grow, and develop skills beyond the battlefield. Recreational activities, including sports, music, and organized games, were encouraged to maintain morale. These activities were not mere diversions, they were integral to psychological recovery, helping prisoners regain a sense of agency and normalcy in an environment structured around survival rather than combat. The surrender influenced German forces still resisting elsewhere. Witnessing entire divisions capitulate without a fight had a profound ripple effect. News of humane treatment and organized camp life spread quickly through both official channels and word of mouth. Soldiers who had considered continued resistance began to see surrender not as cowardice but as a viable and pragmatic alternative. This ripple effect accelerated the disintegration of German defenses, contributing to the rapid advance of American forces across the Rhine and into the heart of the Reich. The surrender of hundreds of thousands became both a practical and symbolic turning point, demonstrating the decisive power of collective rational decision-making in the final stages of conflict. Letters and memoirs from former prisoners reveal that surrender was not a simple act but a series of deliberate choices. Soldiers weighed immediate risks against long-term survival, considering both personal and familial consequences. For many, surrender represented an act of self-preservation that was simultaneously moral and practical. They chose life over death, reasoning that future opportunities, reconstruction, family reunification, and reintegration into civilian society were worth more than adherence to a collapsing ideology. In this way, surrender became a deeply human decision, reflecting the interplay of fear, pragmatism, and the instinct to endure. The surrender also highlighted the role of leadership or the lack thereof. Many German commanders were either absent, incapacitated, or incapable of motivating their men in the final months. Without effective leadership, the rank-and-file soldiers were left to make their own choices. The absence of compelling directives from above, combined with the overwhelming presence of Allied forces, created an environment in which surrender was the logical course. The collapse of hierarchical control underscores the importance of morale and trust in sustaining an army. When both erode, even the most disciplined units can dissolve without significant combat. This phenomenon was particularly pronounced in the Ruhr, where industrial divisions found themselves encircled by American forces. Food and ammunition shortages, coupled with constant artillery bombardment, eroded confidence. Soldiers recognized that resistance would likely result in unnecessary casualties without altering the outcome of the war. The surrender of these units was executed with remarkable efficiency, reflecting both the discipline of the soldiers and the meticulous planning of the American forces. It also provided a stark contrast to earlier conflicts, where ideological indoctrination and fear of punishment had compelled troops to fight to the last man. The aftermath of surrender created a unique environment for observing human behavior. Soldiers were no longer defined by combat performance but by their adaptability, resilience, and capacity for reflection. Daily routines, communal responsibilities, and the structured environment of the camps fostered a sense of accountability and self-awareness. Men who had spent years in life-or-death situations now learned the value of patience, cooperation, and measured judgment. The surrender, far from being the end of agency, became the beginning of a complex process of self-discovery and moral reassessment. Finally, the surrender underscored a larger lesson about the nature of war and human choice. The collapse of 500,000 soldiers without major confrontation revealed that the outcome of conflict is determined not solely by weaponry or tactics, but by the willingness of individuals to assess risk, prioritize survival, and exercise rational judgment. It demonstrated that the human instinct to endure can override ideological indoctrination, rigid hierarchy, and the momentum of propaganda. In choosing to surrender, these soldiers altered the trajectory of World War II, saving countless lives and accelerating the end of hostilities in Western Europe. The final weeks of the European conflict saw the implications of mass surrender ripple through every facet of the German military and civilian landscape. The sheer number of men who had chosen to lay down their arms created a profound vacuum of both manpower and morale. Commanders who had clung to the hope of delaying Allied advances now faced the undeniable truth that the war was unwinnable. Every surrendered soldier was a tangible manifestation of the regime's diminishing control, a visible testament to the erosion of authority and ideology that had once seemed invincible. For the surrendered soldiers themselves, life continued to oscillate between routine, reflection, and the anticipation of an uncertain future. Daily schedules, designed to maintain discipline and prevent unrest, provided structure but also forced confrontation with the consequences of prior decisions. Roll calls, work assignments, and medical inspections became rhythmical markers of a life removed from the chaos of combat. Men who had once marched under the iron will of their officers now found themselves navigating an environment governed by regulations designed not to punish but to preserve life. This structured environment also became an inadvertent laboratory for human observation. American officers and staff could witness firsthand the ways individuals adapted to captivity when their previous identities as soldiers were stripped away. Some men thrived within the imposed order, demonstrating resilience, problem-solving skills, and a capacity for cooperation. Others struggled, wrestling with shame, guilt, and the psychological aftermath of surrender. The spectrum of responses revealed that the act of laying down arms was not merely a single event but the beginning of a multifaceted process of adjustment, reflection, and sometimes redemption. One of the most striking aspects of captivity was the gradual transformation in the prisoner's understanding of courage and honor. Decades later, letters and memoirs illustrate how men redefined bravery, not as blind adherence to orders or the pursuit of death for ideology, but as the rational exercise of judgment in extreme circumstances. Surrender became a choice that required foresight, courage, and moral discernment. Those who had once equated heroism solely with combat learned that survival, responsibility to comrades, and reflection on the human cost of war could also embody valor. Beyond individual reflection, surrender created a complex interplay between the prisoners and their American captors. Initially defined by caution and mutual wariness, this relationship evolved into one of functional respect. Guards recognized that humane treatment facilitated compliance and reduced tensions, while prisoners learned that cooperation could yield better conditions, access to information, and even limited freedoms within the camp. This dynamic was neither sentimental nor casual. It was pragmatic, rooted in the shared understanding that survival, order, and adaptability were mutually beneficial. The physical conditions within the camps also demanded innovation and flexibility. Barracks, tents, and converted warehouses housed tens of thousands of men in confined spaces, necessitating careful planning of sanitation, food distribution, and medical care. Supply lines were stretched to accommodate the needs of the prisoners, while American officers managed logistics in tandem with the ongoing combat operations on nearby fronts. Every shipment of rations, every medical inspection, and every transportation convoy represented a small but critical piece of the larger effort to stabilize vast numbers of surrendered soldiers. Daily interactions within the camps became exercises in human resilience. Soldiers who had endured years of extreme deprivation and constant danger gradually learned to navigate the social hierarchies that emerged within confinement. Units formed bonds reminiscent of former military structures, but these bonds were tempered by the reality of captivity. Leadership roles, once defined by battlefield performance, now focused on organization, discipline, and morale within the confines of the camp. Even the smallest tasks, coordinating meal distributions, maintaining cleanliness, or organizing recreational activities, were opportunities for personal agency and restoration of purpose. Cultural and educational programs emerged as tools for psychological stabilization and personal development. Classes in literacy, vocational skills, and practical trades offered avenues for prisoners to envision life beyond the war. Recreational activities, soccer matches, music, theater, and games provided both diversion and community cohesion. These initiatives fostered resilience, encouraged cooperation, and helped men reclaim aspects of their identity that had been subsumed by combat. In many cases, prisoners discovered latent skills, intellectual curiosity, and leadership potential that had been dormant beneath years of military indoctrination. At the same time, the surrender had strategic implications far beyond individual camps. Seeing hundreds of thousands of soldiers capitulate without confrontation sent shockwaves through remaining German units. The psychological effect was immediate. Morale plummeted, command structures fractured, and resistance efforts faltered. The visibility of surrender demonstrated that survival was achievable and that continued combat, even in isolated pockets, was increasingly irrational. In effect, the surrender of these men expedited the collapse of German defenses in Western Europe, reducing casualties and allowing Allied forces to advance more efficiently. Letters, diaries, and later interviews reveal that soldiers frequently reflected on the broader significance of their decisions. Some expressed relief at having avoided unnecessary death. Others grappled with lingering guilt over abandoning orders or comrades. Still, a common theme emerges. Surrender was viewed as an exercise of agency in a landscape otherwise dominated by coercion and ideological rigidity. By choosing to surrender, soldiers reclaimed a measure of control over their fates, transforming passive obedience into active decision-making. Even as the immediate challenges of daily life in the camps were navigated, soldiers faced the longer-term reality of reintegration. The war had destroyed social, economic, and political structures in Germany. For many, captivity became a liminal space where they could anticipate reconstruction, reassess values, and prepare for a return to civilian life. The skills, discipline, and resilience honed through both combat and captivity would later become crucial in rebuilding communities, industries, and families decimated by years of total war. The surrender also created a space for historical observation and understanding. The choices made by 500,000 soldiers illustrate the interplay between individual agency, collective behavior, and strategic outcomes in warfare. They demonstrate that the human element, rational assessment of risk, moral judgment, and the desire to survive, can decisively influence the course of conflicts, sometimes even more than technological superiority or tactical planning. These events challenge simplistic narratives of heroism or cowardice, highlighting the complexity and nuance of human decision-making under extreme stress. In retrospect, the surrender of such vast numbers of soldiers underscores the adaptability of human beings when confronted with impossible circumstances. While ideology, training, and obedience had guided them through years of warfare, the instinct to preserve life ultimately prevailed. The German soldiers' choice to lay down arms was not an act of submission alone. It was an assertion of survival, a recalibration of values, and a profound exercise in pragmatic courage. As the war drew to its close, the 500,000 men in American custody began to transition from prisoners to participants in reconstruction. Their experiences in the camps shaped both their understanding of humanity and their approach to post-war life. Men who had once been instruments of destruction now emerged as witnesses, chroniclers, and contributors to rebuilding society. The act of surrender, initially framed as defeat, became a catalyst for reflection, learning, and adaptation that would resonate for decades. Ultimately, the surrender of these soldiers offers a powerful lesson about the nature of conflict and the human condition. In choosing life over death, reason over blind obedience, and pragmatism over ideology, they altered the trajectory of history. Their decisions spared countless lives, accelerated the end of hostilities, and revealed the transformative potential of rational choice even in the most extreme circumstances. The story of these 500,000 men reminds us that courage takes many forms, and that survival, reflection, and moral agency can be as decisive as any battle fought on the front lines. In the end, the surrender stands as one of the most extraordinary episodes of World War II, a testament not to defeat, but to human wisdom, endurance, and the capacity to adapt. 500,000 soldiers, facing the unimaginable, chose a path that preserved life, reshaped the war, and illuminated the profound consequences of choice under pressure. Their story remains a powerful reminder that history is not only written by victories and defeats, but by the millions of small decisions made by individuals navigating the impossible, seeking survival, and ultimately shaping the course of the world.